Inside an opulent apartment in Belgravia, London, the atmosphere is stagnant, smelling of expensive candles and old money. Kitty Collins is not a woman deep in self-analysis. She is simply bored. She is currently straddling James Pemberton, but she isn't cataloguing his crimes or weighing her power. He is already incapacitated by GHB, and she is focused on a jagged, sensory fixation, the way the light hits a pair of nylon stockings. Specifically, a pair with crystal seams that she has looped around his neck as a ligature. She isn't horrified or triumphant as she pulls the fabric tight. She is merely struck by an unsettling unease at the total silence of her own conscience. She waits for a surge of guilt or a pulse of panic to break through the fog, but nothing comes. This isn't a dark awakening. It is the ultimate extension of her high society boredom. A sensory jolt so sharp and real that, for the first time in her curated life, she cannot look away from the physical reality of a body stopping. This void of feeling is the reality hidden beneath her blue-tick performance. To the millions who follow her on Instagram, Kitty's life is a relentless cycle of brunch dates, brand deals, and aesthetic management with Hen, Tor, and Maisie. Yet internally, she views this existence with a sharp, biting cynicism. She isn't a victim of the beauty standards she promotes. She is a bored socialite who finds her curated world entirely hollow. This aimlessness is rooted in her father, who she didn't just lose to a disappearance. She killed him. Years ago, she stuck him with a knife like a pig, a chilling echo of the family business, Collins's Cuts. This act established her as a butcher by nature, a secret hidden beneath the luxury penthouse he left behind. She doesn't want to be a hero. She just wants to feel something that hasn't been put through a filter, finding violence to be the only real thing left in her world. The encounter on the embankment with Matthew Berra-Johnson is the moment this boredom is shattered by raw, unscripted chaos. Matthew is not an admirer. He is a persistent and aggressive predator who followed Kitty from a nightclub, his voice a toxic mix of unwanted flattery and bubbling aggression. When he finally lunges for her, Kitty's reaction is fueled by pure, unadulterated fear. There is no grace or skill in the struggle. It is a frantic, uncoordinated scuffle. Matthew, clutching a wine bottle like a weapon, loses his footing. He falls with a sickening crunch, the bottle shattering beneath him and impaling him on its jagged remnants. Kitty stands over him, feeling a cold, dark relief at the removal of the threat. As she watches the blood pool on the pavement, her mind flashes back to a childhood visit to the slaughterhouse with her father. She remembers the sterile white tiles, the heavy, metallic scent of blood, and the process of sticking. This exposure to industrial slaughter is the reason she became a vegetarian, but it is also the source of her chilling detachment from gore. She views blood as a byproduct of business. Her decision to walk away from Matthew is an act of pure, panic-driven self-preservation. She flees into the darkness, but the silence is immediately shattered. A notification pings. An anonymous message from a digital spectre known as the Creep appears on her screen, suggesting that someone saw her accident. The tension shifts instantly from the fear of the law to the terror of being watched by a silent witness who knows exactly what she is. The transition from a passive witness to an active participant was not the result of a sudden realization of power, but a festering necessity born of social observation. For months, Kitty had watched the slow erosion of Maisie, whose heartbreak was a quiet catastrophe in a Chelsea scene that treats vulnerability as a social liability. Through her habit of constant, obsessive digital surveillance, Kitty identified the pattern. Joel was a serial ghoster who demolished women with clinical indifference. The wreckage he left behind sparked a visceral, reactive heat in Kitty. She didn't feel like a hero. She simply felt a pull toward him because she had stopped being a person who followed the rules of restraint. The move toward Joel was a calculated extension of her influencer habits. To get close to him, she meticulously curated the fantasy Kitty persona. This was the work of a social media manager designing a marketing campaign, selecting the exact lighting and buzzwords to trigger Joel's predictable engagement. She wasn't just choosing a lure. She was weaponizing her professional curation to facilitate a confrontation. As she engaged in the digital dance of swipes and messages, she felt pulled along by a necessity she couldn't fully explain, using her marketing toolkit to manage Joel's eventual humiliation. Her entry into his world was an exercise in agent planning. She didn't break in or use brute force. She utilized her access. Knowing Joel's parents were away on vacation in Greenwich, Kitty gained entry into the family home using a spare key she had previously acquired. She moved through the house with an effortless air of belonging, the blue-tick face acting as her social armor even in the shadows. Internally, she was a vibrating mess of paranoia, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm, but she moved with the confidence of someone who knew the world was designed to welcome her. The confrontation itself did not begin as an execution, but a messy, uncoordinated escalation. Kitty confronted Joel about his systemic manipulation of women, But his reaction was one of dismissive arrogance. He didn't see a threat. He saw a woman he could gaslight. It was in the heat of this argument, as his words turned sharp and mocking, that the final boundary of Kitty's restraint snapped. She first swung a heavy, gold-plated Burj Khalifa souvenir, a signature, absurdist relic of Joel's vanity, using it to knock him off balance. Then, in a frantic surge of survival as they grappled, she grabbed a sharp paring knife from the kitchen and drove the blade through his eye. The reality of the act was visceral and horrifying. She had to physically yank the object out of his eye after he fell. The sound and resistance of the act stripped away any remaining romanticism of the kill. This yank was the moment she truly transitioned into the role of the agent, leaving her former self behind. The aftermath brought the darkly comical and crushing physical reality of dead weight. Kitty realized with a jolt of panic that the phrase was not an exaggeration as she struggled to fold a grown man's body into a suitcase. It was a clumsy, desperate battle against physics to get him to her car unseen. The necessity of disposal forced her back to the source of her family's wealth, Collins's cuts. Returning to the abattoir under cover of night was a sensory nightmare. She utilized the heavy-duty machinery of the meat trade to erase the evidence, her hands shaking as she worked through a haze of nausea. Once the disposal was complete, Kitty retreated to the safety of her luxury apartment to perform an obsessive cleaning ritual. She used her most expensive products to shower away the evidence, desperate to scrub the metallic scent of the abattoir and the grease of the machinery from her skin. To finalize the performance of normalcy, she maintained her blue-tick facade by posting a radiant, filtered selfie online. As the compliments and likes flooded in, the dissonance between her outward beauty and the night's horrors became a chasm. However, the night ended with a digital chill. A notification appeared, a comment from the creep on that specific selfie, a cryptic reminder that someone had seen past the filter and was watching her every move. As the weeks blurred into months, Kitty's life entered a phase of high-functioning denial, a state where the horrifying reality of her actions was buried beneath a thick layer of digital normalcy. To her millions of followers, she remained the quintessential Chelsea influencer, but internally, the dominant emotion was no longer guilt. It was a sharp, vibrating paranoia. The pest control ideology served as her only buffer, a sanitized label used to convince herself that she wasn't a monster, but a necessary force. However, the fear of the law and the dread of exposure dictated every interaction. The greatest friction to this fragile equilibrium was Charlie. He was becoming the anchor she desperately wanted to cling to, a man whose genuine altruism made a normal life seem almost reachable. Yet, even in their early connection, he was a source of mounting anxiety. She found herself instinctively editing her personality to match the woman he deserved, terrified that a single slip of the tongue would reveal the rot underneath. The true shattering of her peace began with the self-medication spiral. As the digital spectre known as the creep intensified their surveillance, Kitty's drug use, pills and alcohol escalated to numb the shrieking anxiety of the messages. This chemical haze set the stage for the trip to Mykonos, turning what should have been a sanctuary into a pressure cooker of emotional instability. The creep escalated their psychological warfare, sending an intrusive photo of Kitty at a party, a shot taken from a vantage point she hadn't noticed. The realization that she was being watched even in another country turned the turquoise waters and whitewashed villas into a gilded trap. The breaking point arrived through Tor. The details of Tor's assault by Theo, Archie, and Freddie hit Kitty with the force of a physical blow, triggering a raw, drug-fueled emotional overload. On the luxury yacht, Kitty's actions were born of physical inadequacy and terror. She used GHB as a crutch because she was too afraid of a direct struggle. The kills were her messiest yet. For Theo, she utilized a signature ice pick, a cold and visceral choice that marked the end of her calculated agent persona. In a pivotal mirror contrast, Kitty caught her reflection in the luxury villa after the yacht bloodbath. She stared at her face and realized she could no longer recognize the blue-tick girl she used to be. The agent had completely hollowed her out. This internal decay led to her most catastrophic error upon returning to London, the death of Reuben Reynolds. Driven by a reckless hunch, she targeted Reuben, believing he was his abusive brother, Rafi. The execution was cold and clinical, a syringe to incapacitate him followed by a knife to the neck. But the aftermath brought a profound emptiness and an unshakable sense of unease. When the truth emerged that Reuben was innocent, a quiet man whose only crime was his bloodline, the pest control ideology crumbled. The realization that she had murdered an innocent man destroyed her belief that she was identifying evil with insight. She wasn't a vigilante. She was a blunt instrument acting on delusions. The weight of this failure, combined with the creep's constant gaze, pushed her into a total surrender, leading to the blackout and the overdose that finally brought her to the hospital. The road back from the collapse of her ideology was built on a new, cold resolve. One born of survival rather than righteousness. Kitty emerged from her recovery into a world that felt permanently tilted, the pest control eye having burned away with Ruben's death. This final phase began with a return to the luxury Belgravia apartment of James Pemberton. But this was no random choice. James was the trap, a target deliberately fed to Kitty by Hen. Under the guise of intel, Hen had manipulated Kitty into this final confrontation as a sick test of premeditated obedience. Kitty entered the building through entitled trespass, her status acting as a universal key. Internally, she was a mess of paranoia, believing that killing Pemberton would silence the noise in her head. She utilized GHB to bypass a physical struggle she was too terrified to engage in. As James drifted into a chemical stupor, the door opened. Hen stood there, and the creep was finally unmasked. The final confrontation centered on Hen's psychological obsession. Hen admitted she had been the one sending the messages and the intrusive Mykonos photos. Her motive was a toxic mix of jealousy and a desire to own the one person the world admired but didn't truly know. She wanted Kitty to be a monster only she could see. In that moment, Kitty realized that to survive, she had to stop resisting her family history. She killed Hen not for justice, but for necessity, returning to the abattoir one last time. As she utilized the machinery of Collins's cuts to erase her friend, she reflected on her father's lessons at the slaughterhouse. She realized she had successfully processed Hen just like her father processed cattle. She accepted the meat metaphor fully. She was a butcher, not a victim. The aftermath was a masterstroke of historical revisionism. Kitty did not just hide the bodies. She rewritten history. She meticulously framed Hen for the entire string of murders, Matthew, Joel, Reuben, and the stalking of Kitty herself. She planted the evidence to paint a portrait of a mentally unstable friend who had spiraled into a lethal obsession, leaving Kitty as the ultimate survivor in the eyes of the law. To solidify her immunity, Kitty utilized the Charlie shield. She recognized that Charlie's reputation as a good man and a saintly activist was her perfect human camouflage. As long as she was the partner of a known moral authority, the public and the police would view her as inherently innocent. She wasn't just hiding behind him. She was using his virtue to bleach her own reputation. The story does not end at a crime scene, but on a screen. The final image is a recovery post on Instagram. Kitty shares a muted, aesthetic photo about healing from trauma and finding peace after the betrayal of a friend. The post garners millions of likes and universal sympathy, granting her total social and legal immunity. She stands at a New Year's Eve party, her composure perfect and her blue tick status stronger than ever. She has not escaped her darkness, but she has successfully integrated it into her brand. In her world, the monster is invisible as long as the filter is perfect. The road back from the collapse of her ideology was built on a new, cold resolve. One born of survival rather than righteousness. Kitty emerged from her recovery into a world that felt permanently tilted, the pest control eye having burned away with Ruben's death. This final phase began with a return to the luxury Belgravia apartment of James Pemberton. But this was no random choice. James was the trap. A target deliberately fed to Kitty by Hen. Under the guise of providing intel on a predator, Hen had manipulated Kitty into this final confrontation as a sick test to see if Kitty would commit a premeditated murder solely on her command. Kitty entered the building through entitled trespass, her status acting as a universal key. Internally, she was a mess of paranoia, believing that killing Pemberton would silence the noise in her head. She utilized GHB to bypass a physical struggle she was too terrified to engage in. As James drifted into a chemical stupor, the door opened. Hen stood there, and the digital spectre known as the creep was finally unmasked. The final confrontation centered on Hen's psychological obsession. Hen admitted she had been the one sending the messages and the intrusive Mykonos photos. Her motive was a toxic mix of jealousy and a desire to own the one person the world admired but didn't truly know. She wanted Kitty to be a monster only she could see. In that moment, Kitty realized she had to stop resisting her family history. She killed Hen out of cold necessity and returned to the abattoir one last time. Returning to Collins's cuts felt like stepping into a tomb. The facility was semi-operational, with rusted machinery that groaned under the weight of its own history. The air was thick and stagnant, haunted by the ghost of her father and the memory of the sticking she had performed years ago. As she utilized the heavy-duty equipment to erase her friend, she realized she didn't just inherit his money. She inherited his clinical indifference. Disposing of Hen wasn't messy or emotional. It was industrial. She finally accepted that processing people was the family business. She had successfully processed Hen just like her father processed cattle. She was a butcher, not a victim, and her father's own death remained a cold case disappearance she had successfully buried years ago. The aftermath was a legal masterstroke of historical revisionism. Kitty did not just hide the body. She rewrote history. She meticulously planted evidence to frame Hen for the entire string of murders, Matthew, Joel, Reuben, and the stalking of Kitty herself. She ensured that all the digital footprints of the creep and the physical evidence pointed directly to Hen. She is completely free. The police closed the case, viewing Hen as a mentally unstable friend who had spiraled into a lethal obsession, leaving Kitty as the ultimate survivor and a tragic victim. To solidify her immunity, Kitty utilized the Charlie shield. She recognized that Charlie's reputation as a good man and a saintly activist was her perfect human camouflage. She stayed with him because his saintly reputation made her untouchable. As long as she was the partner of a renowned philanthropist, no one, not the public and certainly not the police, would ever look at her and see a killer. He was the moral alibi that granted her total social and legal safety. The story does not end at a crime scene or in a cell, but on a curated lie. The final image is Kitty at a high society New Year's Eve party. Her composure is perfect, and her blue tick status is stronger than ever. Charlie stands protectively beside her, holding her hand with a warmth that serves as the ultimate shield against the world's scrutiny. She stands in the middle of the celebration, looking at a photo of herself on her phone. With a steady hand, she adjusts the brightness and selects a filter, symbolically editing the blood out of her life. She has not escaped her darkness, but she has successfully integrated it into her brand. In her world, the monster is invisible as long as the image remains flawless.